Experiences on my last two cruises reminded me that just because my cruise ship is calling into a port does not mean that I can assume it's safe for me to get off and explore. In fact, even in the two most popular cruising regions, the Caribbean and the Mediterranean, many of the most visited ports are amongst the riskiest anywhere in the world. Welcome aboard. I am Gary Bembridge and I'm going to tell you what dangerous ports in these two regions to avoid and how to keep yourself safe if you've got a cruise booked that's going to one of them. Let's start in the Caribbean. It's the most popular cruising region, and so it's easy to get lulled into a sense of false security. But poverty is widespread, there's increasing gang activity and political instability, and that's created 6 dangerous ports there. And those two recent Caribbean back-to-back cruises, I called into all 6 of them. In fact, in the run-up to the first of those cruises, which was on Symphony of the Seas, the US State Department raised the travel advisory warning on all ports I was going to be calling into on that specific cruise. Haiti was the first. Haiti shares the island of Hispaniola with the Dominican Republic and gets around 750,000 cruise visitors a year. Now, just before I headed there, the US State Department increased the travel advisory to level 4, which is do not travel due to kidnapping, crime and civil unrest. In fact, they told US citizens to leave. Just as we headed there, gangs had overthrown the Prime Minister. There was widespread lawlessness and violent gangs battling for control, literally in the streets. Now, Haiti has been troubled and dangerous for many, many years. And so cruisers calling there avoid the urban areas by going to Labadee, which is the Royal Caribbean-owned resort on a remote peninsula, and that's fenced off from the mainland. It is a stunning place, though we were actually one of the very last ships to call there as the situation deteriorated even more. At the time of recording, ships are still not calling there, and even when they do, Haiti will, I believe, remain a volatile and risky country. The second port we called onto was Jamaica, another island with many issues. Jamaica is about 100 miles west of Haiti and about 90 miles south of Cuba, and it's a really popular cruise island, getting up to 1.4 million cruise passengers a year. Just before I went there, the US State Department raised its travel advice to level 3, which is reconsider travel, due to the rising crime levels. There are 5 cruise ports in Jamaica: Montego Bay, Ocho Rios, Falmouth, Port Antonio and Kingston. And Symphony of the Seas I was on, we went into Montego Bay. Now, I had seen lots of online advice about avoiding self-exploring outside the secure port area, and some who did on my trip came back and told me that they had felt really unsafe, were harassed and quickly hurried back to the secure area or the ship itself. As a reminder, I will be giving advice later on what to do in each of these risky and dangerous ports like this one. Now, the third port that we went to on Symphony of the Seas was the Bahamas, another one with many issues. The Bahamas is the closest Caribbean island cluster basically to the United States. It's lying roughly between Cuba and Florida, making it enormously popular as a cruise stop. Nassau alone gets around 4 million cruise passengers a year, with 20 to 25,000 passengers often in port each day. Now, just before I went, the US State Department also raised its advice here, but this was to level 2, which is exercise increased caution due to rising crime and murders. On that site, they reported that in the month before I went there, there had been 18 murders, including in broad daylight on the streets, mostly related to gang violence. In addition, a few weeks before I arrived, 2 female passengers on Carnival Elation had gone to Pirates Cove Resort on the Grand Bahama Island, and they said that they were drugged and raped by employees. So the area, despite its beauty and its enormous popularity, has risk. And I did go out self-exploring alone in Nassau, but not for long, because those warnings made me feel less secure. Now, the issues in the area and the fact that it's so beautiful is why I'm sure many cruise lines are now creating their own private islands in the Bahamas. For example, I've been to Holland America's Half Moon Cay several times, which is absolutely stunning. I felt very secure there, and there are many others in the Bahamas, including the very famous Royal Caribbean Perfect Day at Coco Cay, MSC's Ocean Cay, Disney Castaway Cay, and so on. After disembarking Symphony of the Seas, I boarded Oceania Vista, thinking that I'd put all the risky ports behind me. But I soon discovered that 2 of the ports that I went to on that particular cruise had elevated travel advisories against them, and one of the previously safe ports was absolutely no longer one. Let me talk about that one first, and that is Cozumel in Mexico. Cozumel has been considered one of the safer ports as it's an island located off the east coast of Mexico near Playa del Carmen. Around 3 million cruise passengers visit Cozumel every single year. Now, while parts of Mexico have really strong warnings about travel from the US State Department due to crime, gang issues and kidnapping, Cozumel was for the longest time seen as way safer because it's not on the actual route that the drug cartels and gangs use to move drugs up from South America into the United States. But that seems to have changed. 7 days before my stop there, I read of escalating gang issues with what appears to be a gang hit where a man having lunch with his family at a restaurant not far from the Punta Langosta cruise port where I docked was shot dead having lunch. The increase in gang battles and crime was in fact so serious that the Mexican authorities sent in their National Guard, they sent in the army, and they even sent in state police to run raids and try and take control. Now, this is covered really well, by the way, by Jason in his video on the Travel Scouts channel. The next call on Oceana Vista was to Honduras, another risky island. Honduras is a Central American country lying between Guatemala and Nicaragua. It gets around about 1 million cruise visitors every single year. However, it is seen as a country with issues, and the US State Department has a level 3 warning, which is reconsider travel due to crime and kidnapping. Some areas have way more risk than others, which is where Roatan, where the cruise ships call into, comes into play, because Roatan is an island and is seen as having way less risk. There are 2 key ports here, Mahogany Bay, which is kind of Carnival operated and owned, and Coxon Hole, which is where we called on as a non-Carnival group line. I've been to both of those ports, and on further checking before this trip, I saw lots of warnings that the areas outside the enclosed port shopping and entertainment areas, when you're heading out self-exploring, has risen levels of crime, lots of harassment, including by prostitutes. Our next port of call, which also had issues, was Belize. Belize is another Central American country with Mexico and Guatemala on its borders, and it receives again around 1 billion cruise visitors a year because often the same cruises will call on both Roatan and Belize. Now, the US State Department has a level 2 warning here, which, to remind you, means exercise increased caution due to crime, some of which again is gang related. If going to Belize as a cruise passenger, a lot of it hinges on which cruise line you're going with. I was on Oceania, which is part of the Norwegian group, and so we called into their secure private island, Harvest Key, which is just off the coast. It was safe there, it was very beautiful. The tours that they do there all seem to be ocean-based, not visiting the mainland either. However, I have also been to Belize City on a cruise, which falls in the area with high risk of crime, and it was recommended at that time that we do not go out self-exploring. So what should you do in a port like this and the others I've mentioned? Now, more on that later, but before I get into that, I want to move from the Caribbean to the next biggest cruise region, the Mediterranean, because that too has risky ports, but for some very specific regions. These ports to watch out for are not only the main embarkation and disembarkation points in the Med, but several will also be on whatever Mediterranean itinerary you do, because they are major cities. And here it's mostly about big city crimes like pickpocketing and theft. Now, I've seen or know people who've been victims in every single one of these I'm going to talk about. The first is Barcelona, which is the busiest cruise port in the Mediterranean, with around 3.5 million people as cruise visitors every single year. The greatest place of risk is the Ramblas, which is where everybody heads because it's near the cruise port, it's very famous, it gets very busy, and is an absolute pickpocketer's dream. The next is Rome, where most cruise passengers head to from the port of Civitavecchia to explore, of course, the incredibly historic city. Now, on my last visit there, I was on a tour of an MSC cruise, and during our tour of the main sites, including places like the Colosseum, the Pantheon and the Trevi Fountain, 2 people on our tour were pickpocketed at different spots. The other prime one is Venice, which gets around 2 million cruise passengers every single year. Tourists are jam-packed together, they're jostled in the small alleyways, and even in their very large St. Mark's Square, it gets really busy. Again, on my last visit there, I was on a tour of Viking Sky, and one of the passengers on the tour there was also pickpocketed. I had never thought of Athens as being an issue until a follower and patron of my channel, Carol Copeland Thomas, had a pretty traumatic experience being pickpocketed on public transport where even her passport was taken, meaning she could not embark on her cruise as planned. Now, she talks about it on her Conversations with Carol podcast in way more detail, so you can find out more about it there. If you're heading to Livorno, the gateway port to explore Florence and Pisa, those are two other cities really well known for pickpocketing and thefts. So if you're going to any of the ports in either of those regions that I've spoken about, what should you do? First, it's essential that you check the latest advice just before you go, because things change fast, as you will have heard from my experiences around Haiti, Cozumel, Jamaica, and others. I check the US State Department and the UK Foreign Office sites. Both make it really easy to search for the country and are constantly updated. Now, I like the UK site because it allows me to sign up for email alerts by country. So if anything changes, it's even easier because they just send an email saying something has changed. So it means I don't have to keep checking back. I also check ports on what'sinport.com because they often have the latest safety issues listed there and various bits of advice very specific to a port. I also check the daily program and go to the port talks because they should give warnings, although I would advise you to not overly rely on these because I feel they downplay them. On my Symphony of the Seas cruise, for example, for those places with increased travel advisories that I mentioned, they only had rather nondescript, vague references to raised warnings. They weren't very prominent. Second, if you're going to any of these ports, I do recommend booking a cruise line excursion or book one through a very trusted provider and avoid self-exploring. That includes even just walking out and using taxis or those people that kind of stand by the ports offering taxi tours, because there are actually many scams that are related to those that I cover in another video I'll talk about shortly. Third, which is what I usually do in these ports, is stay on board or enjoy the ship or spend time in the secure port area. For example, there was a large one in Jamaica with shops, bars, places to eat and some entertainment. In Roatan, both Mahogany Bay and Cox and Hole do too, the latter even having a recently opened pool with a bar. Fourth, if you are planning to self-explore, take the daily program with details of the local port agent in. They will be absolutely key if something happens to help you sort it out. Of course, don't wear valuables, stay alert and stay in busy, tourist-filled areas. But even if you are going to ports considered safer, there are still risks around scams. So join me in this video where I cover them, starting with the one thing that catches passengers out more than anything else. See you over there.